NextCustomer. Who are they, what drives them, and who will they trust? So we think this segment is really important to zero in on Mrs. Miggins, as Ian said so early. It came out in the first panel session, which was great, but focusing in on the customers. Who are they, what drives them, and who will they trust? There's your clicker. Thank you, Otto.
Can I have my presentation back? Thank you. Well, good morning. I think it is still morning. I'm a bit out of touch because I had to get up at 4 o'clock this morning to get myself down here. I haven't had to do that for ages because now that I'm a non-executive, I can run my life a lot more to my agenda. I also had the benefit at the weekend of traveling with WDL. Does anybody know who WDL are? Did you see the story about the flight to Dusseldorf that ended up in Edinburgh? Well, I wasn't on that one, I'm glad to say. But WDL are a German airline based in Cologne who charter their aircraft to airlines like BA. And I came up from London the back end of last week, and it was WDL that took me. And I think that apart from the fact that they don't allow trolley bags on their planes at all, which caused chaos at London City, and they're also flying in BA 146 jets, which I used to fly on from the Isle of Man to London way back in the early 90s. And they're not aerodynamic 146 jets. They're very good at getting up in the air, but once they're up in the air, the experience up there can be a bit entertaining. The thing about that whole experience, though, was I think there's definitely a case study there in terms of how can something like that happen? How can a flight take off and end up in the wrong place? And the answer is, of course, because all the documentation and everything was entirely in order. It was just the wrong documentation. I think there's something in that which makes me think. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is something totally different from what you were listening to earlier. I'm going to talk about, it's more about social policy than it is about business, but I think you'll see as we go through it that there's some interesting content here in terms of where the customers of 10 years from now and 15 years from now are going to come from. So I'm chairman of NEST, the National Employment Savings Trust, which I'm sure you've all heard of. NEST is a remarkable thing. We have several advantages in terms of how we operate and a number of disadvantages. I'm the only entity, I suspect, in this room which has its pricing set through an Act of Parliament. So I can make no adjustments to my pricing in NEST, it's in the law. And I'm probably the only organisation in this room which has a provider of patient capital who's willing to wait until 2040 to see that money repaid, which is a huge advantage. But the social experiment that we are a big part of is transforming the way millions of people think about their futures, only for most of those millions of people, they don't know it yet. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But in the interest of actually getting through here, let's move on with the presentation. Now, auto-enrollment is something you'll all be very familiar with. The first schemes were set up in 2012. So we've had an experiment running here for 6 years. The staging of employers finished in early 2018. And if you look at the slide here, you can see that there's been an enormous change in the landscape in terms of people saving. Now, the pale blue piece at the top of that histogram is the evidence of momentum building in defined contribution pension saving. So in terms of participation, we're seeing something quite transformational, but I'll say a little bit more about other aspects of it in a minute. And I think first I'm going to talk about employers. NEST is essentially two things. It's now about 8 million savers, but it's also almost 800,000 employers who are using our platform as a mechanism to deliver defined contribution pensions to their employees. Almost 800,000 employers in 6 years, which is quite a striking number. Now, as you can see from that chart, most of those employers are quite small. But I think that quite an interesting thing on that chart is that, I just went back, never mind. About 60% of our members come from employers under 250 employees. But about 40% actually come from employers who are bigger than 250 employees, because essentially Nest is used in two ways. It's used as the core provision for very small and micro employers, but it's used to deal with the lower earnings categories and some large employers as a simple product solution for people who are on short-term contracts and where there's a high turnover of staff. The thing that's most interesting to me, though, is when you start to look at the average earnings of the Nest members. And actually, it's not Mrs. Miggins, because the kind of people we're talking about here are predominantly on average earnings or less. And these are genuinely people who have never saved before. And what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes is just how those people's savings experience is developing, how far they've got, and where they might be in 10 years' time. The actual level of saving, of course, that's being achieved through this at the very early stages of auto-enrollment is tiny. I mean, the contribution levels are 1% kind of level, growing through the increase in contributions through phasing. We saw the first increase in contributions last year. We have another increase in contributions coming through this year. And the good news is that so far that phasing and increase of contributions isn't generating any significant increase in opt-outs. So people are sticking with it. But predominantly, I think most people are sticking with it because the level of awareness they have of the fact that it's actually happening at all is very, very low. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the level of engagement we have with our membership and the level of contact they have with us, and it's very low. This is a whole system that was built on principles of behavioral finance. The concept is that you don't actually notice the contributions coming out of your pay packet every month, and therefore it'll just keep running and things will begin to build up. Now the question is, to what extent is that going to build up to anything worthwhile? And that's what I'd like to talk about a little as we move through this short presentation. But what you saw there were average account balances in the low hundreds and contribution levels which were very low. The other thing that's an absolute theme in the way auto-enrollment is running and the way Nest's experience is showing itself is that 99% of the investments that are made are sitting in default funds, which is back to this inertia model. There's absolutely no interaction between customer and Nest Corporation in terms of managing where that money is being invested or in actually taking a view on how well it's being invested at the moment. But I think there's a few other things I would say. And the first thing I would say is that the data that this analysis is based on, which is 2017, which is the first full year that the analysis has been made available, it's available to everybody. Nest is being funded through taxpayers' money. It's a government-backed entity. From that point of view, my view is that Nest is actually an asset which the whole of the UK should have access to in terms of understanding what it is that it's telling us about people's savings habits, what we can do to try and improve outcomes for people. Because for me, I got involved with this kind of community first when I did a piece of work for government about 10 years ago on how you could deliver generic financial advice into the market. Now that in itself could be a presentation for another time, because there's been some interesting experiences since that study was done and a few organizations that were created to try and make it work. But what I realized was that the financial services industry, with which I'd been associated for decades, and it was fascinating listening to an update on Aegon's progress, having been involved quite actively with that myself over quite a long period of my life. Good to hear it's going so well, by the way. I'm delighted to see that. But the community that the Generic Financial Advice Project was looking at were people who had never really saved to any great extent. who were struggling to keep their head above water in terms of their day-to-day living, where they were resorting to debt as a mechanism to release the tension and the pressure very, very quickly over almost the slightest thing, to be honest. And I think the community that I'm describing here in terms of a community of people who are now saving is that same community. These are largely people that the financial services industry up to now has ignored or neglected. But I think, interestingly, we're now moving into a phase where that process of leaving them off the agenda is a big mistake. And I'll explain why in a minute. I think I maybe jumped over something that I meant to say. Yeah. This distribution of pot sizes, the actual amounts here are very small, but that's because the numbers on which this are based are very early. And if you think about the auto-enrollment programme, it was only over the last 2 years of the phase that's covered here that significant numbers were starting to flow in. And the actual duration of saving here is very short. But what you can see is the distribution of saving in terms of pot sizes is clearly not uniform. There's a very significant proportion of people who have got very small pot sizes, but there's actually a decent-sized tail here of people who are starting to build up larger levels of saving. And that is continuing to be seen. So whilst for most people who operate in the commercial investment market, that kind of level of pot size is probably not particularly engaging, nor does it look like it could grow to be. If you look at the top 30% of the people who are involved here, and if you look at where they are now, and if you look at where they'll be in 10 years' time, the amounts involved actually start to get quite interesting. And I think the thing that we have to take into account here also, of course, is I think what Simon's going to talk about shortly, which is these people may not be conventional pension savers. They certainly will have had no or very little exposure to the financial services industry that's represented in this room. But they are absolutely becoming completely familiar and comfortable with interacting with other service providers using the mobile technology on a day-to-day basis. And that familiarity is creating an opportunity, I think, for us to work with these people in the decades to come to help them actually realize their own potential and to get themselves to a position of as much financial independence as is possible, given their limited means. But at the moment, the engagement level on the pension side of their lives is very low. And we have less than a fifth of our membership who've actually taken the step to register with us to get access to the broader range of services that we offer within Nest on our website. And in fact, where they do register, ABS isn't Advanced Braking Systems. It's actually the annual benefit statement. I did allow, I'm afraid, one three-letter acronym to sneak into the title here. This pattern is remarkable, to be honest, in some respects, and totally unremarkable in another. What happens is every time we send out an annual benefit statement, which we still do through in paper form and in soft form into their accounts, that's what generates the engagement. Now, the only positive for me in this is that it's evident that there are steps one can take to begin to involve people in an appropriate way, to begin to make them aware of what it is that they have here, and to begin to make them more aware of how it's developing and growing. The big question for us is, when do you choose to do that? Because for a system that's been built entirely on inertia, where to a large extent it's being successful because savers are continuing to save because they don't really even notice that they are saving, if we alert them to the fact that an amount of money is being taken out of their bank account effectively every month, what's the response to that going to be? And what's the net impact of that going to be across the savings community? And so there's some piloting work going on already to try out different approaches, different ways of talking to people, different ways of trying to stimulate interest, trying to see what sort of response we're likely to get. What is clear from the research that we're doing is that people, once they begin to engage in the subject, are very aware of the fact that their old age is something they do need to be aware of and be able to try and take steps to prepare themselves for. What's not clear, though, is the extent to which, although they're going to be willing to accept that idea, they're actually going to be able to do something about it. And in truth, the whole auto-enrollment program, which has been a massive piece of social policy intervention, you know, you could very easily argue this glass is half empty as well as being half full. From a participation point of view, I have no doubt that it's been an absolutely fantastic success. If you look at the targets that were set by government, pretty well every single target has been beaten. The opt-out rates are significantly lower than were expected. The levels of participation, the level of take-up and involvement by the employer community has been absolutely fantastic. It's a unique government project, I think, in that respect. But the amounts involved are almost trivial. The amounts of saving that people are actually making are almost trivial. And the pot sizes that for the vast proportion of this community they've managed to accumulate so far, it's not going to make any great difference to their future lives. The only thing that's going to make a difference is if this program continues to run, if these people continue to save for the next 30 or 40 years and actually save more. And I think the questions that are now being asked about the program are, well, to what extent are there policy innovations that could be made right now which would begin to maximize the likelihood that those long-term savings objectives are achieved? And one of the things that's being looked at now is the interaction between debt and pension saving. And I have to say, for me, one of the biggest frustrations of working in the industry, in the later phases of it, was this silo nature we tend to adopt for considering aspects of people's financial lives. So we seem to want to separate out how people are managing their debt on a day-to-day basis from how they're managing their savings and how they're managing their investments, when in truth, for the community that I engage with now through Nest, the two are completely connected. And there is clear evidence, actually, that the level of short-term indebtedness over this period, when levels of pension savings have been increased, that level of short-term indebtedness is certainly, it's not going down. If anything, it's going up. And I saw a statistic this morning as I was heading in here, which suggested that the average credit card balance in the UK now was sitting at the order of £2,500. Now, that's average across everyone. And I dread to think what kind of numbers there are if you look at it as a proportion of income for the community that I've been talking about here. So one of the things we're looking at now, and I think this might be a build slide, so let me just let it build, is the idea of running alongside a pension savings account, a short-term account for access, cash access as well, so that as your regular contributions were put in, a proportion of those contributions would flow into an account which was actually there to support your short-term needs, so the washing machine that breaks down, the problem you have with your car, the thing that's going to push you to perhaps go and borrow on the credit card or get a short-term loan. And something in this territory is now being tested. We have a couple of employers who are working with us to actually put this into practice and to see what the experience is. Because only by testing things and learning from the experience can you actually begin to work out how to fine-tune a core policy which is actually working remarkably well. There are very few things, I think, about the political environment at the moment that you can look at and take anything positive from. As someone who's involved in pension reform, the very positive thing is that it's very unlikely that anybody in government is going to fiddle about with the pension reform legislation for the next 5 years, because they've got too many other things to worry about. So to a large extent, this policy is going to be given more time to roll forward. We're going to get another 5 years of experience. And in the meantime, what we're doing at Nest is trying out on a pilot basis different initiatives that are going to try and enhance the effectiveness of this saving system and identify what makes things work better and how things are going to go forward. Before I finish, the interesting thing for me about this is the role of the employer. I mean, at the moment, it's clear this whole piece has been built around using the employer as the mechanism to gather in employees and their savings, the conduit effectively. It means that large parts of the UK population are excluded, and the self-employed are the obvious category that aren't participating in this at all. And that's a failure of the system. But the question is, how long can that employer-based model survive? The Australian experience is that the individual takes more and more responsibility and ownership of this, and the employer becomes a less key part. If we move away from a model which is employer-based to a model which is more individual saver-based, then the disruption that could cause to the way this piece is running is significant. Somewhere in there, though, is the key where the individual starts to take more responsibility themselves for what's happening rather than just letting it happen to them. And I think, just to finish, at the moment the numbers are trivial, but right now the average pot size in Nest is of the order of £850, and the average savings level in Nest is of the order of £70 a month. Now, £70 a month isn't trivial, particularly when you think that for the millions of people who are saving, they weren't saving at all before. That's quite a significant step forward. If you look forward to 2030, those numbers go up, and these are the averages, to £6,500 and £150 a month. And if you think about that distribution that I showed you earlier, and you think about the top 30% of that distribution, the numbers involved there are going to be taking us into territory, which I would argue is territory that many of the people in this room should start to get interested in terms of potential customers of the future. And I think that's probably, Heather, where I'll stop.